What's the most disturbing way a relative has tried to control your wedding after you specifically didn't invite them? I was addressing invitations at my kitchen table when my phone rang showing my brother Trevor's number. He said our mother had just called him screaming that I'd ruined her life by not inviting her to my wedding to David in 3 months. I told Trevor that was accurate. I hadn't invited her, and I wasn't going to because she'd spent 28 years making my life miserable, and I refused to let her ruin the most important day of my life. Trevor said he understood but warned me that Mom was threatening legal action and claiming she had rights as my mother to attend. I laughed and said there was no legal right to attend someone else's wedding, especially when you'd been abusive for decades. Trevor said he was just giving me a heads up that Mom was spiraling and I should prepare for her to do something crazy. I thanked him and went back to addressing invitations, deliberately skipping the envelope that would have gone to Linda Ashworth, the woman who'd given birth to me but had never actually been a mother in any meaningful sense. My fiancé David came home an hour later and I told him about Trevor's call. David asked if I was worried about what my mother might do. I said I'd dealt with her manipulation my entire life and wasn't going to let her control me anymore, that our wedding would happen exactly as we planned without her presence or influence. 2 days later, a process server knocked on my door and handed me legal documents. My mother had filed a petition in family court claiming I was denying her access to a family event in violation of her parental rights and requesting an injunction requiring me to include her in wedding planning and attendance. The petition claimed she'd been instrumental in raising me and deserved to participate in major life milestones. It painted me as an ungrateful daughter who'd cut her out without justification. I read through it feeling rage build in my chest. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. I called my friend Simone, who practiced family law, and she came over that evening to review the petition. Simone said this was one of the most absurd filings she'd seen because parents had no legal right to attend their adult children's weddings, but my mother had found a sympathetic attorney named Kenneth Fraser, who'd apparently agreed to file it anyway. Simone said we needed to respond with a detailed history of why I'd excluded my mother to show the court this wasn't arbitrary, but rather a protective decision based on documented abuse. I spent the next week writing out everything I could remember. The verbal abuse that started when I was 6. The time she'd locked me in my room for hours as punishment for minor infractions. The way she'd sabotaged my high school graduation by showing up drunk and causing a scene. The time she'd stolen $3,000 from my bank account when I was 19. The constant criticism of everything I did, every choice I made, every person I dated. The way she'd turned family gatherings into performances where I had to play the perfect daughter or face her wrath afterward. I gave Simone 15 pages of documented incidents with dates and corroborating witnesses where possible. Simone filed a response motion requesting the petition be dismissed as frivolous and included my statement as evidence of why my mother had been excluded. She also requested attorney fees as sanctions for filing a baseless lawsuit. The hearing happened on a Thursday morning in Judge William Carver's courtroom. My mother sat across the aisle with Kenneth Fraser, wearing a conservative dress and looking like a victim. Kenneth argued that parental alienation was a serious issue and that I'd been influenced by my fiancé to cut my mother out of my life. He claimed Linda had always been a devoted mother who'd made sacrifices to raise me alone after my father left. He said denying her the chance to see her only daughter get married was cruel and unusual. Simone stood and methodically destroyed that narrative. She presented my detailed statement and supporting documentation. She called my brother Trevor, who testified that our mother had been emotionally abusive throughout our childhoods, and that he'd also limited contact with her for his own mental health. She showed bank records proving Linda had stolen from me. She showed police reports from the high school graduation incident. Judge Carver listened carefully and asked my mother directly if the documented incidents were accurate. Linda started crying and said she'd made mistakes but had always loved me and deserved forgiveness. The judge said love didn't create legal rights to attend private events and dismissed the petition entirely, calling it an inappropriate use of the court system. He ordered Linda to pay my attorney fees of $4,500. Linda screamed when the ruling came down, saying I'd turned everyone against her and she'd make sure I regretted destroying our family. Kenneth had to physically restrain her from approaching me in the courtroom. Security escorted her out while she shouted that the wedding would never happen, that she'd make sure of it. Simone told me to document everything Linda did from this point forward, because her behavior in court suggested she wasn't done fighting. I went home relieved but uneasy. David said we should hire security for the wedding just in case Linda tried to show up. I agreed, and we added that to our budget. 3 days later, our wedding venue called saying they'd received a call from someone claiming to be me canceling the event and demanding a refund. The venue coordinator, a woman named Priya Desai, said something felt off about the call, so she'd contacted me to confirm before processing anything. I told her I absolutely had not canceled and someone was trying to sabotage my wedding. Priya said she'd add a password to our account so no changes could be made without verbal confirmation of that password. I thanked her and immediately called our other vendors to warn them. The caterer said they'd received a similar call that morning but hadn't processed it yet. The photographer said someone had emailed claiming to be me and trying to cancel. The florist had gotten a call but had been suspicious because the voice didn't match our previous conversations. Someone, almost certainly my mother, was systematically trying to destroy my wedding by canceling everything. I called Simone and she said this could constitute harassment or fraud. We filed a police report with Detective Marcus Boyle, who took the information but said without proof of who made the calls, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I get a restraining order if my mother continued the behavior. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment escalated. Linda started calling my workplace, claiming I was having a mental health crisis and needed intervention. My boss, a patient man named Gordon Finch, called me into his office to ask what was going on. I explained the situation and showed him copies of the court documents. Gordon said he understood and would ignore any further calls from Linda, but the calls kept coming, now claiming I was embezzling from the company and needed to be investigated. Gordon had to involve HR to document the harassment. I filed for a restraining order and the hearing was set for 3 weeks out, uncomfortably close to my wedding date. Meanwhile, wedding guests started receiving strange messages on social media. Linda had created a fake account and was sending them private messages claiming the wedding was canceled due to David being abusive and me being unsafe. Several concerned guests called me directly to ask if I needed help. I had to explain to each one that my mother was harassing me and the wedding was definitely still happening. One guest, my college friend Natalie, forwarded me screenshots of the messages Linda had sent. They were elaborate lies about David having a criminal record and me being coerced into the marriage against my will. I showed them to Simone and she added them to our restraining order filing as evidence of ongoing harassment. The restraining order hearing came and Judge Teresa Klein listened to both sides. Kenneth Fraser tried to paint Linda's actions as a concerned mother trying to protect her daughter. Simone presented the systematic attempts to cancel vendors, the workplace harassment, and the false messages to wedding guests. Judge Klein issued a restraining order prohibiting Linda from contacting me, David, our employers, our wedding vendors, or our guests for the next year. The order specified no physical proximity within 500 feet and no electronic communication of any kind. Linda's face went red as the order was read and she said this was proof I'd turned the legal system against her. The judge warned her that violation of the restraining order would result in immediate arrest. We left the courthouse and I felt a small measure of relief. Maybe now Linda would stop. I was wrong. 2 weeks before the wedding, our venue received a bomb threat. Someone called saying there was an explosive device hidden in the building set to detonate during our ceremony. The police evacuated the entire hotel and spent 6 hours searching with bomb-sniffing dogs. They found nothing. Priya called me in tears saying the hotel management was reconsidering hosting our event because they couldn't risk another threat. I begged her to reconsider, explained about my mother and the restraining order. Priya said she'd advocate for us but couldn't make promises. The hotel ultimately agreed to continue hosting us but required we pay for additional security, an extra $2,000 we hadn't budgeted for. Detective Boyle investigated the bomb threat and traced the call to a burner phone purchased at a convenience store near my mother's apartment. Store security footage showed someone matching Linda's description buying the phone. She was arrested and charged with making a terroristic threat, a felony. Linda posted bail within hours and immediately violated the restraining order by showing up at my apartment building. She stood in the parking lot screaming that I'd had her arrested and she'd never forgive me. David called the police while I locked our door and stayed away from windows. Officers arrived and arrested Linda again for violating the restraining order. This time bail was set higher and she spent 3 days in jail before Trevor posted it against my advice. Trevor called to apologize, saying he'd felt guilty but now realized it was a mistake because Linda had immediately started calling him demanding he convince me to drop the charges. The prosecuting attorney on the terroristic threat case, a woman named Diane Kovac, called me to discuss Linda's mental state. Diane said Linda's behavior was escalating dangerously and asked if I'd noticed any signs of psychological instability beyond the harassment. I told her about a lifetime of Linda's volatile moods and manipulative behavior, but said I wasn't qualified to diagnose anything. Diane said she was requesting a psychiatric evaluation as part of Linda's bail conditions. The evaluation happened over 3 days at a court-ordered facility. The psychologist, Dr. Raymond Cho, determined Linda had narcissistic personality disorder with delusional elements regarding her relationship with me. His report stated Linda genuinely believed she was the victim, and I was an ungrateful daughter who'd been turned against her by David. Dr. Cho recommended intensive therapy as part of any sentencing and warned Linda was unlikely to stop her behavior without intervention. 1 week before the wedding, I woke up to find my car windows smashed and paint poured over the hood. Security cameras in our building's parking lot showed Linda's car pulling in at 3 a.m., and someone matching her description vandalizing my vehicle. She was arrested again, this time charged with criminal mischief and violating the restraining order a second time. The judge revoked her bail entirely and held her in custody pending trial. With Linda in jail, the final week before our wedding was relatively peaceful. We did final fittings, confirmed vendor details, and tried to relax despite everything that had happened. The wedding day arrived and I was nervous not about marrying David but about whether something would go wrong. The security team we'd hired swept the venue before guests arrived and maintained presence throughout the event. The ceremony was beautiful. My brother walked me down the aisle and I cried when David and I exchanged vows. The reception was joyful with friends and family celebrating without the toxic presence of my mother hanging over everything. For the first time in my life, I had a major milestone that Linda couldn't ruin. Several guests commented on how happy I looked, how relaxed. I realized they'd never seen me truly at ease before because Linda's presence had always created tension. The day was perfect in ways I hadn't even realized were possible. We honeymooned in Greece for 2 weeks and tried to forget about the legal battles waiting at home. When we returned, Diane Kovac called with updates. Linda's trial on the terroristic threat charge was set for 2 months out. The criminal mischief and restraining order violation charges would be rolled into sentencing. Linda had been offered a plea deal of 2 years in prison and 3 years probation with mandatory psychiatric treatment. She'd refused, insisting on going to trial. Diane said Linda was representing herself after firing Kenneth Fraser for suggesting she accept the deal. Diane warned me the trial would be difficult because Linda would have the right to cross-examine me and would likely use it to attack my character and justify her actions. The trial began on a cold Monday in October. Linda sat at the defense table looking thin and angry after 2 months in custody. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They played the recording of the bomb threat call and presented evidence linking it to Linda. They showed the vendor cancellation attempts, the workplace harassment, the messages to wedding guests, and the car vandalism. They presented the restraining order and documentation of Linda's repeated violations. I testified for 4 hours about my decision to exclude Linda from my wedding and the escalating harassment that followed. Linda's cross-examination was brutal. She accused me of lying about the abuse in our relationship. She claimed David had brainwashed me. She said I'd always been a difficult child who'd required strict discipline. She suggested I'd fabricated evidence to make her look bad. She asked why, if she was so terrible, had I maintained contact with her for 28 years. I answered calmly that I'd spent years trying to have a relationship with my mother despite her treatment of me, and that finally setting boundaries didn't mean my documentation of her behavior was false. The jury looked uncomfortable during Linda's questioning. Several jurors were visibly disturbed when Linda claimed the bomb threat was justified because I'd left her no other way to stop the wedding. The prosecution rested after 2 days. Linda's defense consisted of her own testimony claiming everything she'd done was out of love and concern for my well-being. She testified that she'd tried to cancel vendors because she believed I was making a mistake marrying David. She said the bomb threat was meant to delay the wedding, not hurt anyone, so I'd have time to reconsider. She claimed the car vandalism was done by someone else despite video evidence. Her testimony was rambling and often incoherent. She'd interrupt herself to complain about the unfairness of her prosecution, or to attack my character. The judge had to remind her multiple times to answer questions directly. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Linda showed no reaction when the verdicts were read. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and Diane said given the verdict and Linda's refusal to accept responsibility, the judge would likely impose a significant sentence. The sentencing hearing was brief. Judge Carver, who'd dismissed Linda's original wedding petition, had been assigned to the criminal case. He noted that Linda had been given multiple chances to stop her behavior, had violated court orders repeatedly, and showed no remorse or insight into her actions. He sentenced her to 4 years in state prison on the terroristic threat charge and 2 years for the restraining order violations, to run consecutively. 6 years total. He also ordered 5 years of supervised probation after release with mandatory psychiatric treatment as a condition. Linda finally reacted, screaming that I'd stolen her life and I'd pay for what I'd done to her. She had to be physically removed from the courtroom by bailiffs. I sat there feeling exhausted and sad. I'd never wanted my mother to go to prison. I just wanted her to leave me alone and let me live my life. But Linda's inability to accept boundaries or consequences had led directly to this outcome. Over the next year, Linda sent me letters from prison. They were initially angry and accusatory, blaming me for her incarceration and demanding I recant my testimony. When I didn't respond, the letters became manipulative, talking about how much she loved me and how she'd change if I'd just visit her. I never responded to any of them. Simone advised me to keep them all as documentation in case Linda resumed harassment after her release. Trevor visited Linda a few times, but stopped when she spent every visit demanding he convince me to forgive her and help get her sentence reduced. And then 3 years into Linda's sentence, I got a call from her prison therapist, a woman named Dr. Veronica Hunt. Dr. Hunt said Linda had finally begun making genuine progress in treatment and was starting to understand how her behavior had been abusive. Dr. Hunt said Linda wanted to write me a letter taking responsibility for her actions, without asking for anything in return. She asked if I'd be willing to receive such a letter. I thought about it for several days before agreeing. The letter arrived 2 weeks later. It was different from the previous ones. Linda acknowledged that she'd been abusive throughout my childhood and had refused to respect my boundaries as an adult. She said she understood why I'd excluded her from my wedding and that my decision was justified. She apologized for the harassment and the crimes she'd committed. She said she didn't expect forgiveness but wanted me to know she was working on understanding why she'd behaved the way she did and was committed to changing. The letter asked for nothing. It didn't request visits or contact or forgiveness. It simply acknowledged the harm she'd caused. I kept the letter but didn't respond immediately. David asked if I thought Linda's change was genuine or another manipulation. I said I didn't know and wasn't ready to risk finding out. 6 months later, Dr. Hunt called again. Linda was up for early release based on good behavior and successful completion of treatment programs. The parole board would consider her case in 2 months, and Dr. Hunt wanted to know if I'd be willing to submit a statement or attend the hearing. I told Dr. Hunt I'd think about it. I discussed it extensively with David and with my own therapist, a woman named Teresa Murphy, who I'd been seeing since the wedding to process everything that had happened. Teresa said I didn't owe Linda anything and shouldn't feel obligated to support her parole, but that if I chose to, it should be based on what I needed for my own peace, not what Linda needed from me. I decided to write a statement for the parole board. I described Linda's lifetime of abuse and the escalation after I excluded her from my wedding. I also acknowledged Dr. Hunt's report of Linda's progress in treatment. I wrote that I supported Linda's early release on the condition that her parole terms include continued psychiatric treatment and a strict no-contact order with me. I stated clearly that I was not ready for any relationship with Linda and might never be, that her release should not be contingent on reconciliation with me. The parole board granted Linda's early release after 4 years served with conditions including ongoing therapy, regular check-ins with a parole officer, and a no-contact order that would remain in place unless I specifically requested it be modified. Linda was released on a Thursday in March and moved into a supervised living facility an hour away from where David and I lived. Her parole officer, a man named Dennis Kwan, called to confirm I'd been informed of Linda's release and to provide his contact information in case there were any violations. For 6 months, Linda maintained the no-contact order perfectly. Then I received a letter. It was mailed from Linda's facility and contained a single page. Linda wrote that she understood I didn't want contact but wanted me to know she was doing well in treatment and had gotten a part-time job at a library. She said she thought about me every day and hoped I was happy. She said she didn't expect a response but wanted to respect my boundary while also letting me know she was working on being better. The letter felt different from her previous communications. It wasn't demanding or manipulative. It was sad and genuine. I showed it to Teresa and she asked how it made me feel. I said it made me sad but also hopeful that maybe Linda was actually changing. Teresa asked if I wanted to respond. I said I wasn't ready yet. A year after Linda's release, Trevor called saying Linda had reached out asking if he thought I'd ever be willing to talk to her. Trevor said he'd been maintaining limited contact with Linda and had seen real changes in her behavior. She was attending therapy consistently, taking medication for her diagnosed disorders, and had stopped making demands or trying to manipulate him. Trevor said he wouldn't pressure me either way but thought I should know Linda seemed genuinely different. I talked to David about it extensively. David said he'd support whatever I decided, but wanted to make sure I was protecting myself and not responding to guilt or obligation. He reminded me that Linda had put us through hell and we had no duty to welcome her back into our lives. I appreciated his protectiveness, but also found myself curious whether Linda had really changed. I decided to write her a letter. I kept it brief. I acknowledged receiving her letters and said I appreciated her respecting my boundaries. I said I wasn't ready for direct contact, but I was glad she was doing well in treatment. I said perhaps eventually we could have a conversation, but it would need to be in a therapeutic setting with a mediator present. Linda responded 2 weeks later. She thanked me for writing and said she understood my conditions. She said whenever I was ready, she'd participate in mediated conversations. She said she knew she'd destroyed our relationship and might never be able to repair it, but she was committed to trying if I ever gave her the chance. 2 years after Linda's release, 3 years after my wedding, I finally agreed to a mediated session. Dr. Hunt arranged it at a family therapy center with herself as the mediator. David drove me there and waited in the lobby while I went to the session room. Linda was already seated when I entered. She looked older, grayer, but calmer. She smiled tentatively when she saw me but didn't try to hug me or touch me. We sat in chairs arranged at angles so we weren't directly facing each other. Dr. Hunt explained the ground rules. This was a space for honest communication without accusations or defensiveness. Either of us could pause the conversation at any time if we felt overwhelmed. The goal was simply to begin rebuilding trust, not to resolve everything immediately. Linda spoke first. She apologized for everything she'd done during my childhood, and especially for the harassment surrounding my wedding. She said she'd spent years in therapy understanding that her behavior came from her own untreated trauma and mental illness, not from anything I'd done wrong. She said she finally understood that love didn't mean control, and that she'd never actually allowed me to be my own person. She said she was sorry and understood if I never forgave her. I listened and then shared how her behavior had affected me. I talked about spending my entire childhood walking on eggshells, never knowing what would set her off. I described the years of therapy I'd needed to undo the damage of her constant criticism. I told her about the anxiety I still felt sometimes that I was inherently bad or unlovable because she'd treated me that way. I said the wedding harassment had been the final proof that she'd never see me as a person with my own rights and autonomy. Linda cried while I talked but didn't interrupt or make excuses. When I finished, she said simply that she heard me and believed me and was sorry. The session lasted an hour and we agreed to meet again in 2 months if I felt ready. I left feeling exhausted but also lighter somehow. David asked how it went and I said I wasn't sure yet, that Linda had said the right things but I needed to see if her actions matched her words over time. We had 3 more mediated sessions over the next 6 months. Each one, Linda listened more than she talked. She answered my questions honestly. She took responsibility without deflecting. She never once asked for more than I was willing to give. Slowly, carefully, I started to believe she might have actually changed. 4 years after my wedding, Linda was invited to our home for the first time. It was brief, just coffee and conversation with David present. Linda met our dog, admired our renovations, and asked about our lives without prying or criticizing. When she left, she thanked us for the visit and said she hoped we'd be willing to do it again sometime. David said afterward that she seemed like a completely different person from the woman who'd terrorized us years ago. I agreed, but said I'd stay cautious. Trust had to be rebuilt slowly. Now, 5 years after the wedding Linda tried to destroy, we have a limited but genuine relationship. We see each other every few months for supervised visits. She's met our daughter, born 2 years ago, in controlled settings. She's respectful of our boundaries and has never once overstepped or made demands. She continues therapy and medication management. She's built a life for herself that doesn't revolve around controlling me. Sometimes I look at her holding my daughter and I see glimpses of the mother I wished I'd had, the person she might have been if she'd gotten help decades earlier. It makes me sad for the childhood I didn't get, but grateful that my daughter will never experience the version of Linda that I grew up with. The woman who filed a lawsuit to attend my wedding and then made a bomb threat when that failed is gone, replaced by someone working hard to be better, even knowing she'll never fully repair what she destroyed. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.